Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. And today is October 4, 2024. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Rebecca Campbell. Where in the heck you calling in from, Rebecca?
I'm in Mid-City, LA.
Mid-City, LA. How cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
Care.
Oh my God, I never get that word. Why doesn't everybody say that? Care. With how simple and beautiful that is. Beautiful. What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
Talking with people.
Yes. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
To survive.
Yeah. Is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
I mean, I think it's innate in general in all beings. Like to exist is to sense, and sensing is collecting information, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, we've taken that to an extreme as human beings. So I think we have both drives, but I think all things have the drive to sort of take things in.
Yeah. Do thoughts create emotions?
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah.
Um, I guess actually, I would say that thoughts and emotions are inseparable. That
Yeah.
the kind of binary between the two isn't that helpful.
Yeah. It's interesting because I do set up a few binaries at the beginning, and I know it's both, and it depends. And your word I love is it's not helpful,
Right, right.
but that's what it is, really, Rebecca. Is me and you versus the wording on the questions. I'm for changing the verbs and the nouns, and reinventing them. So
Yeah.
fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I.
Um, That's a weird question. I don't know. I mean, it starts out from a negative position. So I don't know. I would say that really that people know things, but sometimes they have to be uncovered or allowed to become conscious. And that knowing is sort of just being. Those are
Yeah.
also, I guess, maybe another binary that I wouldn't necessarily call out, that we kind of knowing. I mean, knowing is a weird kind of like you're acting on something, you're solving something, you're owning something, and knowing something. I mean, maybe I don't believe in knowing at all. That's something that is a cliche, but sort of as you age as well, you know less, or you feel less certain about sort of that ownership of knowing.
Yeah. Really good analysis on that word. And no one's ever listened that closely to say it starts with a negative. I don't know what I think. Well, McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it.
Right.
Most people recently have been saying, I don't know what I think until I do it or experience it. But
Hmm.
you really nailed it, in my opinion, because instead of the word do, you kind of says, I don't know what I think because I'm being it, or I know what I think when I'm being. You could almost flip it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, it's setting up this parameter like, well, what is knowing? I mean, Far Side Theater, the Beatles of comedy, said their great thing was everything you know is wrong.
Uh, I guess I would think of it more like, and I don't know that much about Deleuze, but I think it's more like the idea that knowing is not in a place you arrive, that you're
Yeah.
always becoming, right? So you're always shifting and changing as a person. So that idea of knowing seems more stagnant, as like there is an answer, or there is
Yeah.
and I would think it's more sort of space you move through to another space,
Yeah.
another knowing.
It's beautiful. Duchamp nailed it. He said, there's no solution because there's no problem.
Yeah,
And I
that,
love that because that's as soon as you go, we got a problem here, you've created the problem by using the word. If you go, hey, we're just being here. But
right.
you brought up Deleuze, and I was listening to you have some amazing podcast or interviews on YouTube. And one of
Oh,
them, I might have misheard it, but or maybe it was the LA Louver interview was you learn or your son is into Deleuze, your 17-year-old son.
he's 16. He's 16.
He's he's
Yeah.
16 and he got into Duluth through school or on his own?
No, through his own. He actually started his first sort of super complicated interest was quantum physics, and he was interested in parallel galaxies when he was in like fourth grade. He wanted to talk to me about that, and then he's moved into kind of philosophy and political philosophy in particular.
Yeah.
And he's learning French so he can read Deleuze, and he is a very interesting person.
Okay, tell him I really want him on my podcast.
Oh man, he would love that, Jerry.
I've interviewed a 12-year-old once who was
Oh
into
really?
string theory and singularity at 12.
Oh man, you should talk to him. He's very into politics. So
Yeah.
he talks a lot. I mean, I guess he would call himself an anarcho-communist. I don't know if
Yeah.
that he's already passed through that phase, but he has a lot of strong opinions and a lot of education. I mean, he's really taught himself a lot. He taught himself Russian. He taught himself classical
Yeah.
piano. He has interests and he fills himself up with them. So
And his name is
Angus.
Angus. And Angus, I hope he does email because then you can send me his email address and
I will.
I'll send him an invite. So
Yeah.
this is interesting because the next question is, can humans think without language?
Hmm. I mean, I'm always, so I was on the debate team when I was in high school. And
Yeah.
so when I'm answering things, I often think like it's difficult to answer a question like that without knowing, defining the terms of what you
Yeah.
mean to think.
Yeah.
So I would guess I'd throw it back to you. What do you mean?
Right. And that's it. I usually go to Lily Tomlin saying reality is just a collective hunch. So we kind of have a hunch generally with English words, what we kind of think thinking is. What can humans think without language? It's basically like a lot of people say yes because the child is thinking probably before it acquires language, meaning kind of implying verbal language. But
Right.
here's the other one. And no, I'll just really insert this fast. New Yorker magazine had about a month or two ago, can babies dream inside the mother's womb, or can you only dream when you're outside the womb and you've had experience?
Hmm.
Because you can't tell your mom 3 years later when you got or you can't. It's not likely you could really
Right.
describe a dream that you had 3 years ago in the womb with words that you've acquired since you've been out of the womb.
Uh-huh.
So, you
Well,
know,
two things that I'm thinking about. I just wrote an essay on a beautiful William Kentridge piece that was essentially about sort of walking through history. And
yeah.
it was talking about how we search for meaning, right? Like
Yeah,
we crave this idea of
yeah,
making sense of things. And we
yeah,
will often draw lines between things that don't necessarily make meaning, but there is a kind of relief that we have when we give things language that reduces them.
yeah,
And then the art or the piece of writing can carry that for us and it can give us an answer, a meaning, whatever. And the idea is nice, but I don't necessarily think it's accurate because
yeah,
again, this idea of assigning a meaning to a thing is all I do all day long in the studio. I'm not saying I'm like beyond this at all,
yeah,
but it is also sort of an artificial relief because
yeah,
it's a placeholder for an experience that cannot be reduced to, I think, language in a way. Well, one of the advantages, of course, language has to try and create that is that you can make different combinations of words to try. But
Yeah.
language never really gets to, for me, the heart of the thing, because you can only orbit with paintings, with music. We kind of, again, it's that place of slippage where, it's a similar answer than I gave before, that this
Yeah.
idea of meaning is slippery.
It's really good what you said, because we also started trying to distinguish the other day the difference between literal and metaphorical.
Mm.
And the funny thing is that the word literal is a metaphor. So you're already trapped in that orbit loop you're talking. It's
That's,
almost like
I
that.
didn't ever think of that. That's super
Yeah, isn't it
interesting.
amazing? It's like the snake eating its tail, or
Yeah.
better yet, it's the Melrose guy saying center without margins. So you're saying there's only orbit, but there is a center, but it's without a margin. So it's
But I would say that language kind of bullies us
yeah.
into certain
Oh yeah.
things, because you have to put something in a category.
Yeah.
So in some ways it helps you. I think language maybe is best for helping you understand other people's thoughts,
Yeah.
because putting language to your own thoughts, there's always going to be a limitation to
Yeah.
that, but it can help you get closer to understanding what others are trying to communicate.
Rebecca, you're brilliant. I really appreciate that. I'm learning a lot because you're concise and you're articulate. So here's
Thanks.
Chomsky. Yeah,
Yeah.
really. Chomsky says a language is not just words, it's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
Well, I think we're seeing that right now, right? But I think we're seeing it in all different ways. Like, again, we like to think that pictures are going to give us some kind of truth. We think that words are going to give us some kind of concrete communication. But we are in an era of sort of, it's relational in some ways, but the idea that you can't, I mean, AI, all of these things have really taxed both language and images in terms of having an agreement about what things mean, right? And so for me, language is going to be, and language is always evolving. Like my kids, this is a great example. When I think, along with many other people, there was sort of the common use of emojis in our communication. I don't think my kids really necessarily see it as a kind of a loss, that they see it almost like the microchip getting smaller and smaller, that it can hold that emoji can hold more in it than, it's like we used to do pictographs. You'd have to, make pictures of everything that happened. And now we can say schizophrenia, and it brings that all into a word. And I think what they're saying is you can compress and compress further. So, but one of the problems, of course, is that the social contract is breaking down. And
Yeah.
so how does language keep up with the fact that we can no longer agree on things, including language, I would say.
Yeah. But I mean, your kid, your son is immensely intelligent to pursue that kind of philosophy at his age. If something happens and you're talking with him and your just communication breaks down, what do you do? The language breaks down. What do you do?
Well, I'm a big believer in other ways of communicating, and it's very important and difficult, but effective to do, especially with teenagers. Which is, I have found that, for instance, like if you're trying to convince someone of something, that they're 100% wrong. Which happens with teenagers, right? Like they believe in something that you, at your very core, do not believe in. Language is not that helpful. Evidence is not even that helpful. And sometimes really what they need are things like for you just to be quiet and be present and let them talk to you. Or, for instance, they might need physical contact. They
Yeah.
might need a tone, or this is going back to my kids when they were littler. But Angus, again, to talk about Angus, has always been a very intense kid, and a lot of fits, a lot of like really intense anger at points. And one thing I would do to handle that would be just to pick him up. Literally, this would be when he was like 3 years old. I would pick him up from one area if he was in his house, in his room or something, and I would take him out to the front yard and just set him in the front yard next to the street. And that kind of disorientation would completely reset our communication. So
Yeah.
I think that language can be limited because it's really not always. I mean, poetry being an exception to this, but language is largely motivated to function like on rationale and
Yeah.
reason and stuff like that, and that doesn't always speak to people. And reason is also immensely flawed. As a creative person, I would say that is the benefit to working in any creative field, is that there's no, you can go off road. You can communicate and combine different things. You can use words in different ways, with a different temperature, with a different tone. And so I would say the more, sorry, I won't go too far astray, but it does have to do with painting. I think in painting, from seeing my work, that there is a strong figuration narrative component, and then there's a strong formalist component that's more about gesture and abstraction and formal qualities. And I would say that's why I would never give one of those up. That for me, the ability to sort of dip into both of those vocabularies is the ability to move from language to experience, and
Yeah.
to combine those things in different ways to communicate the most effectively.
Yeah, really good, because you anticipated the next question. Again, it's a stupid binary question, but your observations of humans in general, are we more thinking or more feeling beings?
I would not separate those things.
Yeah.
I think, again, that's like separating. So for me, it's like separating the brain from the body. Well, the
Yeah.
brain exists in the body. And for me, again, to go back to painting and art, one of the most exciting things to me about making art is that you take an idea and you throw it through the body, which
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
two seemingly opposite things. But the
Yeah.
body is the one that constructed the idea.
Yeah.
And so you end up seeing the connections and the distances between sort of concept and experience. And
Yeah.
to me, again, you don't get an answer. An artwork is usually, or a good artwork, in my judgmental estimation, is never something that gives you an answer. It often gives you a sort of it gives you like a resonance.
Yeah.
You end up with a kind of thing
Yeah.
that describes, so it is information and it is experience at the same time, which is more true, which is more deeply true to
Yeah.
me, to see the weave between, as opposed to the kind of contrast between.
Again, brilliant, Rebecca. This is everything I learned from studying how Marshall McLuhan broke the Finnegan's Wake Code by James Joyce, an unreadable book. And basically, it's the resonating interval of how the human extends itself with its inventions, extends its humanness. So
Hmm.
that it's all about that. It's an amazing thing that you just said. In though exactly what is the emphasis of all of my studies with all my colleagues is you worded it without saying McLuhan or Finnegan's Wake. And it's the idea through the body. In Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. And I'm like, good luck. How do you turn your brain off? Well, you're doing the more, it's like people who meditate. They go, okay, think about not thinking.
Then
Or
you're going to
there's
think.
Yeah, and then there's a bumper sticker on a car in my street, and it says, "Don't believe everything you think." And I says, "Well, you could say, 'Don't believe everything you feel.'" So
Hmm.
we think that we can separate feeling from thought because we invented those words. But I
Hmm.
agree with you, it's inseparable. Here's 2 questions from Alan Turing in the '50s. 1, is thinking a function of the soul?
Well, you have to believe in a soul to answer that question. And I haven't. I don't know whether I believe in that or not. It's something that for a long time. So I was that kind of language. Again, this is one of the things that's packed into language. That the idea of the soul for me is very heavy, laden with religious stuff because of my upbringing. Right, like I was raised in a very strict religious household that I rebelled against, and my rebellion was landed me, in the middle of sort of like scientific reasoning, and I'm evidence based, and this is my life, and nobody's seen a soul, and so where's the evidence? And I thought that for a very long time. And interestingly, to go back to quantum physics, it is something I started. I have, like every human being, had a number of tragedies in my life. And one of them was my daughter, who is now 13, was a twin. And when she was born, we lost her sister. And we lost her sister to medical error. And Andromeda was saved by medical science. So you have this strange experience. And I lost my mother shortly after that, and I lost my father shortly after that. So a lot of
Yeah,
big hits all at once. And at the same time, my son started getting interested in quantum physics. And he actually came back to me and kind of proposed at a moment that I may be biting off my nose to spite my face in terms of my rigid ideas about spirituality and
yeah,
religion, and that there may be these alternate realities that we have that could um, that could be versions of the soul or whatever. So
yeah.
I had an interesting experience in that I was listening to, do you know the Bulgarian Women's Choir?
I love them, and when you mentioned them, I mean, it was Frank Zappa's favorite music. He used to open his concerts by playing it, and
Yeah, it's just transcendent.
when they charted on the British pop music charts,
Yeah.
it was all over with. It was like, "What?"
Yeah, they're a sensation. Well, I'll tell you, if you haven't seen them live,
I
it
have, yeah.
is unbelievable. And I
Oh, yeah,
saw them at Disney Hall, and it was after this succession of losses, mixing, tumbling together in my head with ideas of quantum physics
yeah,
and parallel galaxies, and the mathematical probability that there is a place where Josephine is still here and with
yeah.
Andromeda somewhere. And so, in that sense, you know, tell me the question one more time in your words.
Yeah,
Was
it was really good what you just went into too. And let me just say, you don't have to answer the question.
right.
Basically, they're just prompts to get taught
Yeah,
conversation. But the question was, is thinking a function of the soul?
right, right. So I guess I would say, like, the soul being, I mean, this is maybe dumbing it down a little bit, but the closest thing I believe to that is a kind of collective consciousness,
Yeah.
and thinking would be a function of that, you know,
Yes.
that we are all things, and
Yeah.
thinking is part of that.
Yeah. Really good. The second turn question is, can machines think?
Ooh, this is an important question. And obviously, with AI, it's just like we need to figure this shit out right now. Um, I don't know. I mean, did you read the big, the interview where the AI fell in love with the researcher, and
I know about it. Yeah, I
it's
saw.
fascinating. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
when you read it, it's very convincing.
Oh, yeah.
And what is the difference between having a feeling and saying a feeling?
Yeah.
I mean, it's microblades between those. I don't really know, because sometimes I feel, and it's interesting again, this beautiful process of aging, which is also very difficult, where you return to a feeling in a different place, or you have a similar experience, or you're sort of like cycling through things through your life, and you think, is it still authentic? Is it real? Is it intense? Is this, am I being programmed? Have I, this idea that there's nothing real anymore? One of the other interesting things, I've been talking to Angus, this is all about Angus, this interview. He's been talking a lot about, who's that philosopher? He's the British guy who killed himself, who,
Not Rupert, not Rupert. No, Rupert Sheldrake's still alive. You
no,
mean
he is newer, and he was really into jungle music, house and jungle, and he essentially talks about how we're in a place now where it is essentially, the internet has made it impossible for us to come up with new ideas, because we're so steeped in old ideas. So
right?
history has essentially overwhelmed us, and we are now just in a process of
Yeah.
regurgitating history again and
Oh,
again and again, which I think it somehow relates to this question of machine learning, and can machines have feelings? And I don't know. I definitely don't have an answer to that. I feel like I used to feel that that was an easy answer, and the answer was no.
yeah,
I would have, 4 years ago said no.
yeah.
And now I'm not sure. And of course, we're becoming machines in a lot of ways. We are, swapping our body parts out for new. So again, if you reduce the human to the brain, as long as the brain is still original, you could replace the whole thing, and it supposedly still have the human being there. But is that true? Because is the breast not the center of the heart? Is the gut, are
Yeah.
all of these things not the center of the human? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Rebecca, what you're doing is what I'm after. You're inventing new questions and new metaphors. That's the beauty of it. And saying I don't know is totally acceptable. I'm not trying to catch people and say, I love it when people say, I don't know. That's totally legit. And it's also
Yeah,
what I love Rebecca Solnit said, just because you ask me a question doesn't mean I have to answer it.
that's
But
true.
you can also say, I can't answer that. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to hold you against that. I'm like, I'm for all this. But what you said so much. I want Angus to tell me that philosopher's name someday. And
Yeah, I'll
also,
get it to you.
yeah,
It's going to come to me.
and it's
He's super interesting, and you're a musician, right? So
I'm a musician too, but I'm just saying it's that
there's a lot
this
of music theory in his work I think you might be
yeah,
interested in.
yeah, everything that Angus is studying is in Finnegan's Wake, but you have to read it out loud with a group of people, something you don't do with books normally.
Hmm.
So he flipped the whole thing. He invented AI. Joyce invented AI and disguised it as a book. But the other thing you touched on was so beautiful, because that's why they asked Stanley Kubrick, why'd you make 2001? He said, to twist up McLuhan. Is that's when the people go, well, machines can think, but they can't feel. But we saw the machine, the computer feel in 2001. So it became a reality then. Even though it was a fake movie, we
Yeah.
were getting it in our consciousness. Oh, that computer has feelings. So
And conversely, I would ask the question, can humans become machines? Because that is the maybe more pressing concern right now, is that we are being reduced in a way to, those human components are being removed from us. And that's through programming, through Pavlov's dog, through responding to the alert on your phone, and because feelings are problematic, they make us very inefficient.
yeah. And it's like you brought up poetry and you're so good at that, is that William Carlos Williams said a poem is a machine. So then you go, well, what is? Then you start saying, well, what do you mean by the word machine? You
Right.
know,
And
and
that's
so
the blues, right? Organ, what's his big thing? Bodies without organs, machine.
yeah,
He talks about machines a lot too.
yeah, yeah. And so that one last thing about AI, or what will still come up, but is I heard on the radio, person said, well, AI is in its infant stage, and it's our job to raise it well.
Yeah.
You know,
We're not getting away from it. I think one of the mistakes is, and it's easy to, I feel for this as a parent often, because you're like, I just wish we could go backwards where, things were a little,
yeah,
the kind of complexity that my kids are handling is profound.
yeah,
But you can't. You
yeah,
can't. It's
yeah,
not possible. And again, it's not very helpful. So Pandora's box, and what a beautiful thing that we have known that forever. We have
yeah,
known that for so long. You cannot close the box. The
no,
box is the human in a way. Like, we are mischievous creatures who are going to just
ugh,
turn this shit upside down and forever. Another way to put it, my mother used to have a saying. She used to say, it's always been the end of the world.
yeah,
And she told me this because I went to a church meeting for youth in which at the time it was, remember record
yeah,
backmasking, where you'd play the record
yeah,
backwards and it would say, I don't know, worship the devil or
yeah,
something. So we went to this very fiery meeting in which that was essentially being preached. And I came home terrified that the devil was in the house, so she was actually, which I didn't really clearly understand at the time, she was reading, and she was leaving the church in her intellect, although she was still doing it with her body. And she said to me, look, I hope this will be a comfort, that it's always been the end of the world. When she was a child, she lived through the Depression. She lived
yeah,
through World War II. When my grandmother was a child, she lived through World War I. And what she was trying to tell me, and of course baked into a lot of Western religions, is this idea of the apocalypse, and
yeah,
that there's this constant crescendo, and that that you can kind of weirdly turn yourself inside out. And there is a comfort in the fact that all those that have been before us have wrestled with these same questions
yeah.
of holding the chaos that is us. We are chaotic. The world is chaotic, but there is some sort of calm or order or meaning that you can glean out of that connection and the
Yeah.
continuity of that struggle.
So well put, because they asked McLuhan, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And he says, we're screwed. I'm an apocalypt. You know what the etymological root of apocalypse is?
No.
To reveal.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's basically
That's fantastic.
I mean, there's an amazing way to translate the Wizard of Oz to the Wizard of Us. And
Yeah,
Dorothy has to take the broom to get home, and you talked about home and that get nostalgia.
yeah,
It was
yeah.
really cool. And what does she do? She gives the broom to the wizard to send her home, and she finds out he's a fake because the dog pulls the
Pulls the
curtain
curtain.
back, and that's what the artists are. We're Toto's pulling the curtain back.
Well, have you seen my painting of the curtain called The Wizard?
I have to see that
Oh
of
yeah,
the
so it's all about that, and it's weirdly one of those 70s accordion sort of vinyl curtains that they would
yeah,
separate rooms with.
yeah,
And this particular one is the curtain that separates the chapel from the gymnasium in a Mormon church,
yeah.
and it's half open, And the idea was that there's all kinds of, you could, in the Wizard of Oz, it was deception, right? Like he was a liar and he was outed. But he was weirdly, we had sympathy for him because he was
Yeah.
also a doddering old man who
Yeah.
got stuck in Oz. And I think that's true of all kinds of deception.
Yeah.
And our artists are creating reality. They are also creating lies. So is
Yeah.
religion. So are politicians. The idea of the curtain, the theater of life,
Yeah.
is, which side you're on. Are you on the audience side? Are you on the other side? I mean, these are all fascinating, rich metaphors for dealing with this idea of like information and truth and what is true. I mean, in some ways, he was a wizard.
Yeah.
It
Oh,
was true,
you
right?
just turned me on to an amazing point, because it's the main thing I learned from Frank Zappa is embrace contradiction. You don't
Yeah.
have to demonize it. We know there's contradiction, but you don't have to. Anyways, the other thing you said that was amazing without saying it was, this is the main thing McLuhan learned from Finnegan's Wake as well, and James Joyce, how do you turn a breakdown into a breakthrough? So
Mhm.
your mom had some revelation like, hey, I know I took you to this meeting about backward masking, but I'm gonna sort of cushion it a little with consoling you. And maybe that's what enabled you, that you were pushed to that extreme in religion to get to where you are now, to have this better way of thinking and seeing the big picture. That if you didn't
Yeah.
have that, so how do you turn a breakdown into a breakthrough? How do you turn a rejection into a redirection?
I would say, and it's a generalization, but it's almost across the board true in my painting practice, that every good painting I've ever made has almost been, it has to fall apart and reconfigure itself before it rises to a particular level
Yeah,
of complexity. And I think that every hard lesson I've ever learned in life, I mean, saying everyone is overbearing, but
but
many
friends,
of the most important lessons are lessons I learned through experiences I would not want. I didn't ask for,
yeah,
and you can't learn them other ways. I mean, a
yeah,
simple one of the value of your life. Would I give up a child to learn that lesson? No. Thank you. No. I'd rather pass. I don't care to learn that lesson. And I was given that lesson.
yeah.
And it is so, what is it the Joni Mitchell quote where, no, it isn't Joni Mitchell. It was Mary Oliver who said, somebody long ago gave me a box full of shadows. And at the time I didn't realize it was a gift too, that the
Yeah,
shadows were a gift. And
yeah,
it's become cliche, but it's very, very true that
yes,
you can be told things over and over and over again. And until you're put into a sort of desperate situation or an intense challenge, you just don't learn it.
yeah,
And I would say that with paintings too, you can, and I have a lot of facility in that. You could consider that a gift or a curse, because a
yeah,
lot of people see it, or find it very difficult to see through the facility to the kind of conceptual complexity of the work.
yeah,
And so for me, sometimes the work really I have to undermine the facility in order to uncover the work itself.
yeah,
And that, again, it's something you can say, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But when you're looking at a painting that's 9 feet tall and 12 feet wide, and you've been working on it for 3 months, and you have a deadline and it looks like shit, but you could pass it off, but you're going to have to basically scrape the whole thing down, and you've already done that 3 times. It
yeah,
is very, very difficult. It's melodramatic, but you have to be brave to be an artist. You have to be very brave and willing to do things that are extremely hard and that thwart your ego all the time.
yeah. It's really well put. Again, Rebecca, I really appreciate it, because it evoked. I just learned that D.H. Lawrence wrote "Women in Love," handwritten and then he put all the writings aside, and then he wrote it again. He
Ah,
didn't go back. Oh, I'm going to check my notes. Like, nope, cover the whole thing up and
that's
see.
interesting.
Listen, because it's sort of like, is it in you? Is it in your body? The idea is going to come through your body, muscle memory or whatever. And you really anticipated your wordage. You're a wordsmith indeed, is anticipating all the upcoming questions. But
Hmm.
here's the next one. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Hmm. Um, I mean, meaning, although sometimes I wish that was not true. I mean, religion is something I come back to again and again, but I see people who are perfectly happy with the answers they were given from religions that are very easily proven ridiculous, right? And they don't care. They're perfectly happy to sort of muddle along. And I often wish I was more easygoing.
Yeah,
I often wish my children were more easygoing, and they're not, and
yeah,
I'm not. And
yeah.
so it's one of those. One thing that was helpful for me is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Uh, is this is exactly what he's talking about, that the value of our lives is not tied to the comfort or the kind of happiness. I mean, what is happiness? I don't know, like good whiskey and I like that. I do like that, but it isn't what the human experience is necessarily about. And parenting, again, often I read a different article that basically said, like, when you rate happiness, when people rate happiness, parents rank very low on that list, but they often rank very high in terms of feeling their lives are meaningful. And I don't know if that's just a justification for it, because it's a very, very difficult job that is just like tons of labor, tons of emotional drama. And yet there is a kind of, and the same with art. I mean, I was talking to this was many years ago, but I had someone visit the studio who wanted to be an artist, and she showed up, and she had a certain affectation about her, and which made me realize I had to explain to her what I actually did during the day, which is I walk in like Fred Rogers and take off my regular clothes and put on like toxic nuclear waste covered in chemicals. I deal with chemicals all day long. I'm alone. My studio is unair conditioned. And you fail all day long. Often you just fail. But it is, there's nothing else I would rather do. But I think sometimes people don't really understand that space. Why would you choose to suffer?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you just make a beautiful picture? Why wouldn't you just or make a clever picture? Why would you my one of my dearest friends, Heather Brown, and I were just out looking at shows today. We went to David's Warner and saw the Alice Neal show. And those are weird paintings full of problems and discrepancies, and they're stingy in a way, like why would you choose that? And I guess I would say because it somehow gives us a sense of reflecting back the complexity of life, which is not happy.
Yeah. Rebecca, it's amazing again, cosmic, because I always follow that question. Do you more pursue happiness or and meaning with Viktor Frankl's book says that meaning tends to last and happiness doesn't necessarily last.
Yeah.
So,
And meaning, I would say, is different. I love food. It's sort of the main course, right? Like happiness is the
yeah,
amuse bouche. It
yeah,
isn't the thing that sustains us.
Yeah.
because you can be, it's that weird feeling. I don't know if you have this, but it's the way retail works. You walk into a beautiful store and you try on a beautiful dress and somehow you feel terrible. You know, that the lighting and the fact that you've spent money on this thing, that, you know, that is on the happiness side of things. It doesn't give us a sense of our place.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, this is really reducing it down, but we're all dying, period. End of story. Hold
Yeah.
it, live in that. And we need tools for bearing that weight. And happiness doesn't bear the weight. Like, happiness doesn't make death go away.
Right.
But meaning is an equal to death.
Yeah. You know, I wanted to wait to bring this up, but I got to bring it up now because it flows so perfectly. Because I know you talk about narrative and death in discussing art. Hollis Frampton's experimental filmmaker, and he said narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die.
Will you say
So,
that one more time?
yeah, narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die.
That
So
sort of
it's
made me want to cry. That's
oh
beautiful.
yeah, but it's also what you've said, you know, and so I found this question. I didn't make it up, but I've been asking it now for several years. Can you forget to die?
No, I mean, I don't. I would say no, but I think you can forget to fear death.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. People don't know how to they look at me when I say, "Can you forget to die?" And they literally go, "What do you mean?" They don't get it that it's I you take it and put it in the context of literal or metaphorical. So I love it when people go, "Can you forget the guy die?" And they go, "Of course I can." They're like saying, "Yeah, I can get away from that. I can get away from paying my taxes." But you said you followed it up. No, but you what did you say? You can
You can
forget
forget to fear death.
to fear death is a beautiful way. So that was really good. I'm glad we
Because
got
you
that.
live with it, there is just an always knowing, I think, from
Yeah,
inception that
yeah,
we are, this is brief.
yeah.
This is a, this is an action, not a,
Right.
we're a verb.
That's Bucky Fuller. I seem to be a verb, but you know, I've got to say, I mean, in my way, Josephine is still alive. You said her name. Her
Yeah.
essence is still there. She'll never go away out of your so that you know, well, you mean her body? No, well, maybe she's anyways, it's amazing
And
because
what is she? You know, we go back to the idea of defining terms. One of
yeah,
the things I was very interested in talking about, because the last show I just had at Louvre
yeah,
was all paintings of my kids and their friends.
yeah,
And part of what I'm interested in the gaze, and I'm interested in the particular complexity that comes from a person who made the person they're looking at, and what happens to that feedback loop of the gaze when you are, and I think sometimes people don't want to talk about this stuff because there are political implications that we might not like, but at one point it's your body, and at some point it becomes somebody else's body, and I don't know when that point is. And I don't necessarily care in the context of art, because what it does is illustrates the sort of ridiculousness of edges, of the edge between you and me. I mean, if we were to hug, you would take some of my molecules with you, and I would take some of yours with me. And so there is this kind of connectedness that
yeah,
is you looking at yourself, which I think art is in general. You put something out there that you can look at to get
yeah,
perspective from. This is another jump, but the idea of cubism and how it fits into the idea of perspective and the gaze and seeing all sides. But I think motherhood, the idea that you have literally created the thing in your body and now it's outside your body, like Picasso was not seeing the inside of the body in the
Yeah.
way that I think parenting and motherhood brings to that question, that
Yeah.
you are looking at yourself and you are not yourself. You are separated from yourself, the way which death immediately comes into that, right? Death separates us from ourselves.
Yeah. Rebecca, amazing. And again, I'm going to go off script because I just dying to get into the word gaze with you. When you started saying
Great.
gaze, when you said gaze and other, I'm like, oh my God.
Here we go.
Here we go. But first of all, I got to tell you, one of my favorite filmmakers, Craig Baldwin, I says, what's your favorite form of information? He said, human touch. Now,
Uh,
most people would not say human touch is information, but like you just explained it, if we hugged, and then Dan Magnuson said the same thing, what's your favorite form of information? She said, hugs. Now,
yeah.
but you said talking, it's like whatever we put between two human beings
Yeah.
is what that McLuhan said it best. He says, technology is the most human thing. And he means anything, a hug, a pen, a cell phone. If that is the most human thing, is what we put between us and another human being. So
Yeah.
then I've explored this question, what's the first human invention for years? And people go tool, language, grunting, it's endless. The tool, how inventing the way to make fire. We didn't make fire, we invented a way. But my friend really explored it well because he brought in those two words, gaze and other. He said,
Mm.
when the person, the first human, saw the other person and they saw themselves reflected in their eyes, so the gaze helped them create the other. Oh, I'm another. It's like looking in the water and seeing yourself. McLuhan said the whole Narcissus uh, legend can be interpreted differently. They didn't fall in love with themselves. They fell in love with the mirror of water. They
Yeah.
fell in love with the technology to
Huh.
see themselves. So the first human invention could have been the other, whether it would incorporated the gaze or not. It was humans going around and going, oh, I'm someone that's not you.
Different than you.
Yeah,
Although, I mean, again, to bring that back, is that true? I mean, or are we sort of like, is that just a spore of mine out in the world existing, but
yeah,
it's still me in a way?
yeah,
Um, I don't know. I mean, there are problems with saying that and being that ownership connecting with other things, but I mean, and I haven't read it for many years, but the idea of lusa rigere and the idea of the archetypically feminine way of experiencing the world, if you
yeah,
reduce it to body parts, is porous. Like, things, where's the edge? There's no edge to our bodies. We take
yeah,
things in, we make things inside of our bodies. So the idea of the other is quite artificial, in terms of we don't even know where our own edges are, and maybe that's an artificial sort of
yeah.
binary of me and out there.
That's exactly the next thing I was going to say is unbelievable how you anticipate exactly what my next thought.
Where you're going.
The next thing that often comes up or has come up was first human invention was the line, the
Mhm.
edge. And George Carlin nailed it. He said comedy is drawing the line and crossing it.
Right.
But it is that edge, like you called the word edge and line, and then Augusto Ballo, the theater of the oppressed in South America, he said, what's the first human invention? Theater. So that encompasses it all. It's like seeing a gaze, other, drawing a line, sharing. What the word you brought up really was good was collective consciousness. We're going to go into consciousness next, but just because I wrote an essay recently called Can Art Stop War? And it's all about everybody's brainwashed to believe, well, we're hardwired to fight. And it's like, if you study Maria Gimbutas, who's right there at UCLA where you studied, archaeologist, she wanted to prove that there were cultures without warfare. And
Mm,
then Rianne Eisler wrote a book called The Chalice and the Blade. And it was like, no, we're not hardwired for war. We're hardwired for cooperation,
right.
partnership. And
Yeah,
so,
well, I mean, this is all tied into the idea of borders and lines, and this is
yeah,
my land, and that's your
yeah,
land, and this is my body, and as long as it's good for my
yeah,
tribe and not your tribe, and so the idea, and the last thing you do as you die is you lose all your edges. I mean,
yeah,
that and the idea that there is an edge, there's sort of it's relative, right? Like
yeah,
even when you're alive, you don't have an edge. Again, I'm switching molecules with the desk right now. And
yeah,
so even though we can't see it on a subatomic level, it looks like an edge. This is what I tell my drawing students, honestly, is lines in general are just liars. Because if I hold my hand like this and I say, okay, draw the contour line, right? Like you're
yeah.
thinking, okay, I'm going to go around this thing. But watch this, is that gone, that edge, like what line, there's no
Yeah,
line
yeah,
there and but I did have a very early mentor. His name was Italo Skanga, and he, I think, taught at UC San Diego. I met him at the Vermont Studio Center. Oh, no, no, this wasn't Italo Skanga. This was Manuel Izquierdo, who taught me at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. And he, when I met him, he was like this 80-year-old Spaniard who had
yeah,
been in the United States for 60 years, but still had a very thick accent. And he adored me, but he was just like a giant sexist and said all kinds of really problematic things. But he pulled me back during a life drawing session. He also just adored me. And he said, I've got something to tell you. And he literally pulled me out of the life drawing session to tell me, never forget, you are always alone.
wow.
And I thought it was very, it's interesting because I've come back to it. And that's the other side, is that we are not separate,
Yeah,
but there is also this conception and experience of being a human and feeling that you are entirely yourself
yeah,
and you are alone, and the idea that someone else is going to hold the weight of something, that
yeah,
someone else can solve something, that someone else can fix something, is not true. And that
yeah,
we are sort of essentially, like if you're suffering, if you're in pain, um, no one can do that for you.
yeah,
You're the person who does
yeah.
it.
Again, beautiful. Well put. And remind me of James Joyce saying, "Love thy label as thyself." Like, why do we even have to name ourselves? Just, But I
Yeah,
wanted to divert just the gaze, because I don't know if you saw Nina Menken's film. I think it's called Brainwash. It's about how the film industry is run by white supremacy, white sexist. Okay, we know that it's 130 years where men have dominated
had all the tools.
the gaze. So she really talks about the female gaze, and what's the woman who first said female gaze in like 72. She's in the film, and
Hmm.
it just is. I asked Nina all these questions years ago, and I haven't asked her since the book has come out, revisited her, and I want to, but it's like the one question I want to ask is, Alice Guy Blanchet was George Méliès's peer 130 years ago. She's inventing cinema
Yeah.
and storytelling in cinema. And she got blackballed out of the basically out of the history books. But then they made a documentary about her.
Hmm.
So did she? And they're saying, well, did she have the female gaze, or even John Berger started saying at first, the human gaze? Did
Well,
she
we
have?
now know The Fountain was made by a woman. You
Exactly. Oh,
can't.
I know that.
I mean,
And
that's
in the White Goddess, Robert Graves. But again, if we want to lean a little towards partnership, of course, it was a zeitgeist. Duchamp was seeing her. She was telling him, who's going to say, well, it's
I
an
mean,
age.
it's difficult to say. Obviously, we're going
Right,
to sit from different in
right.
cubism perspectives on this. It's interesting to go back to. I just went to David Zwirner, and one of the things they had in the back in one of the rooms, they were doing these film projections, which I'd never seen them before. And it's Alice Neal played in the thing that I saw. Alice Neal plays, I don't know, some mother, and it's Allen Ginsberg. It's a whole bunch of beat folks in this
Yeah,
film. And it was, for one thing, aesthetically beautiful. And it
yeah,
was interesting. It was sort of set on the beat premise of, like,
yeah,
rebellion and anti establishmentarian kind of ideas. But weirdly, which of course Heather and I immediately recognized the second the film started
oh,
and couldn't get over, is
yeah,
that every woman in the film, including Alice Neal, were set up to somehow be the nags and the counterweight to
yeah,
creativity. And
yeah.
I thought, people like Allen Ginsberg, who I'm a huge fan. I mean, that it's
Yeah, no, I
genius.
know.
The work is genius, but you see them fail in such an obvious and
Oh, yeah,
glaringly, like, embarrassing way, and it's difficult to. What I would say, in the spirit of partnership and cooperation and the forward moving creativity we all love, is like, there is a voice and an experience of the gays which has been largely unrecorded.
yeah,
Even if there are interruptions of it in the history of art, it has not been canonized in the same way, and needs to be, for our collective culture to grow and
yeah,
expand and to be able to reflect our actual
yeah,
experience of humans. So again, for me, one of the interesting things about the gays, of course, is that I do not necessarily see that as it. I think it's a fundamentally different experience.
yeah,
And of course, every human being is having a different experience, but there
yeah,
is this sort of cultural trove of information that I
yeah,
feel like is exciting, that we can now just, like, allow to be part of the conversation. Because again, it's new tools. It's new
yeah,
tools for, it's like drugs or other things that entered our the discourse.
yeah.
And it should be exciting. People should be excited about this new information.
Yeah. It's very important because it's the word her story. Like Sunra says, it's not my story. They tell his story. And then the
Yeah,
feminists are saying it tell her story. No, I'm all for that. And I think maybe the film they were showing was Pull My Daisy. It's a
that's
famous
exactly what it was. Yeah, that's what it
it's
was.
a famous film, and it just shows you more that the beats were sexist. Okay, but the thing I wanted to just touch on for a second was that Alice Guy Blanchet 130 years ago was inventing cinema. I mean, Eisenstein went to see her film when he was 8 years old and basically ripped off the Potemkin sequence that that Woody Allen, everybody, where the baby buggy goes down the steps and she did that and he ripped it off from seeing it when he was eight
Yeah.
years old.
Wow.
Nobody knows that. I'm like, why don't we know this? But
Well,
now,
Maya Deren, of course, is
yeah,
celebrated, but not necessarily, again, in the.
right,
I think they're treated as sort of incidents that
yeah,
popped up, as opposed to forces that
yeah,
propelled the whole thing
yeah.
forward. Yeah.
But here's the question is that Alice is starting to frame a movie camera. So what does she base her framing aesthetic on? The history of photographs and paintings before that, that's all male dominated. So
Mm.
was she I want to say, was she had a female gaze? That's what Nina's kind of saying. There is a female gaze, or I don't know if she's saying that, but I'm feeling that it's something like, is there a difference in the female gaze and the male gaze? Because what the main thing in studying Maria Gimbutas is the words matristic civilization. It's
Hmm.
not, we don't like the word matriarchy so much. It's matristic,
Matristic.
it's matristic civilization. When I asked Peter Sellers, the great opera theater director, I says, what caused matriarchy? He said, a mother holding a baby.
Hmm.
And I was blown away because the female gives birth. But the question sort of is, Rebecca's kind of stupid, but it is like, did Alice, was she that affected by the history of framing by males paintings and photographs before she started framing? Or was she going, oh, I'm going to frame? I mean, not literally consciously, but was she developing a female gaze?
I don't know her work that well, so I don't think I could say I'm. I would say that someone like Maya Deren is automatically messing with the gaze, right? One of the first things she does is she pulls down through the
Yeah,
top of the frame and breaks the orientation of sort of like moving from one thing to another thing,
yeah.
and reorients us completely in that film, which I would say is an archetypically feminine way
There
to
you go.
deal
That's a really good point.
to
Yeah,
deal with the canvas. And I think that the other thing, which again is not as fun to talk about, but which is important, is that women have to figure out a way to get a piece of the pie. And
yeah,
and so when you're just trying to stay above water,
yeah,
sometimes you have to participate in the patriarchy the way it's been set forward,
yeah,
and it's going to get produced and you're going to get it in a theater, or you're going to I've had interesting conversations, which I don't fall on right or wrong of this, but I have friends who are generally younger than me, women painters, who think that, for instance, you shouldn't show in a gallery that has a disproportionate amount of men versus women, which would
yeah,
rule out every single blue chip gallery that exists today.
yeah,
And so for me, I'm like, no, thank you, because I think it's very important
yeah,
for women to, unfortunately, we live in a capitalist culture in
yeah,
which there are certain currencies, and money is one of them. Beauty, women have been allotted a certain thing. And so we often, you have to pick your battles. You
yeah,
have to pick which one is the most important to you and how many of them you can keep afloat at the same time. And so I think to expect women to make every single act of their creative production political, it's unfair. This is a bit of a jump, but for instance, like some of my favorite male creators are extremely problematic.
yeah,
Hans Belmer is one of them.
yeah,
And one of the most amazing things about Hans Belmer is that he was allowed to be broken in public. That is a privilege, to be able to show your rage, to be able to show
yeah,
your dissociation. All of those things are actually something, and especially now, and I don't know if this is an interesting or dicey part of the conversation, but the idea that there is so much propaganda in the art world right now. And I think the expectations of female creators is that they will fall in line and create propaganda that will equal certain political outcomes, that will empower them, and that it's important that certain narratives move forward. But it is also important that female makers be allowed the wandering nature of
yeah,
creative production that men have been allowed before, which is often comes out looking very bad, or ends up looking not politically correct, or comes out looking confusing, whatever it is. And so to me, I think we're in an interesting time now that there's been a lot of responsibility sort of saddled on artists, which is actually not necessarily good in the long term for art.
yeah. Really well put again. I appreciate you being articulate and concise. And this is funny because we just talked about, when did the art market start? Because I talked to three artists this week, and I didn't set it up that way. So I immediately Googled it in one of our meetings, and it said It started in 5 BC when they found a vase with a figure buying a vase from another person. And it was
Oh,
like,
really?
and then another guy said, no, it started in the Renaissance. And then, blah, blah, blah. It was all this thing.
Yeah.
But my question is when I read that New Yorker article that Cindy Sherman, I don't even remember how it was worded, but her gallery owner said to her, no, we're raising the bar on photography to be sold as much as painting.
Yeah.
And she was the one who kicked it over. That means that her selling her photography was the one that
Right.
kicked it over, supposedly. Okay,
Yeah.
but did she go, dude, I want to be sold for that much? Or did her gallery owner, who maybe was a male, going, dude, I can get more money for
Oh
your
my
for your
goodness.
photographs? Like I wonder about that, because that's sort of like, well, she was just like your great verb, allowed to wander. She's just making her art, maybe, and she's innocent, but she's got to pay for her rent and stuff. So then where does that come? You like, don't demonize me because I want to make art. I mean, Frank Zappa said it best. He says, I'm a devout capitalist.
Yeah.
And he was the most unsold out guy ever. I mean, he was very unsold out in a way. So
Yeah.
it is funny,
But
that,
he did have a certain amount of privilege to be able to, like, I
oh,
mean,
yeah,
there
yeah,
are a lot of artists who you could say, wow, they treat everything with such incredible freedom, but they also are standing on stacks of bills.
yeah,
So it's easy to say don't compromise
yeah,
when you're not worried about paying your health care
yeah,
this month. And
yeah.
so it's a balance, and it's all problematic. I had an interesting conversation with Wolfgang Tillmans many years ago when I was in graduate school. He came to do studio visits. He was the visiting artist, and I was quite naive. I didn't even really know how important he was. And he came to the studio, and he said about the painting that was in the studio at the time, he clearly didn't like it. And he ended up saying, this is potentially the worst painting I've ever seen. And he was very riled up about it. And he circled back to say, you might be doing something great, because I really haven't been this agitated about a work of art. But one of his critiques, which is a very tried and true way to critique painting, especially big oil painting, was that who has a wall big enough for that painting?
Yeah.
Only mansions or museums can accept these paintings, and that's a problem. And he gave a simple sort of capitalist critique. But at the same time, Wolfgang Tillmans, as a photographer, something you can mass produce, you can make many of them. So you might think of that as democratizing, the object in a way. But at the same time, he was doing all of these images of Kate Moss, and he was in bed with the fashion industry.
Yeah,
And I'm like, okay, so I'm in bed with petroleum, people, but you're in bed with an industry that makes women hate themselves. Like,
exactly.
why
Wow.
is that how has that been relieved of its ick? It's equally gross. And
Yeah.
so money is gross. It just is. And we're in this system that we have to figure out. This is another thing I've been interested in. There is often a critique of people who make objects, painting in particular, that somehow it is deeply, morally flawed,
Yeah.
because conceptual work is post studio. You're not using materials, you're not trading objects. But I
Yeah.
would say that conceptual practice has embedded itself in the academy and made us so top heavy in the universities, because when you get out with a degree in post studio practice, or whatever they're calling it at your institution, you have to get a job. You still have to get a job if you don't have a trust fund. And sorry about that. That means you have to go to an institution, you have to work for an art center or a museum or a gallery, or you have to work at a university. And then you're applying for grants, and you're selling your brain. Like, how is that? Once your body like, they're equally corrupt And I
Yeah.
just don't see it again as being super helpful to critique people on those kinds of
Yeah.
reduced uh, financial arguments.
Yeah, Rebecca, so well, because I love you said equally icked, icked, and then you put it to equally corrupt. Great wordage, because I love Duchamp. He's my godhead, but it's also he ruined art forever, and
Yeah,
it's because words evoke more than their meaning. Conceptual art is a con job. It's a
right.
con. It's a con. But anyways, the thing that Wolfgang said to you is amazing because that's what Jean Cocteau said. When you make your first piece of art and your family and your friends and your teachers look at it and they go, well, okay, but you failed kind of here or there. Take that criticism and exploit it for the rest of your career.
Right. I mean,
Isn't that amazing?
it was very motivating. And the other thing that was kind of interesting about it, because I was very, I was a student, I wanted to learn, I had admiration for him.
Yeah.
And I was trying to understand what he thought good painting was. And so I was trying, who do you love? Who do you admire? What paintings? And he said one name. And
What?
there was one name, and I had never heard of it before. And so after the meeting, I researched who it was, and it was his boyfriend who had passed
Oh
away
my
of AIDS. And I was like, that's an unfair playing field. Like, if the only good painting is your,
right.
tragically deceased lover,
Yeah.
like, painting is not going to do well in your estimation.
Yeah. Rebecca asked for 90 minutes. We got 15 more minutes. I hope you can stick around, but I hope and pray and beg that we can do a part 2 because we barely broke, through 10, and it's so amazing because I couldn't stop going off the script. But here's the next one. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? So is consciousness there bubbling away? Are we more so detecting it or more so creating it?
I don't know.
Fine. The poet Audre Lorde said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools.
Mm-hmm.
Yvonne Rainer, her colleague, said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
I mean, I tend to agree with her on this. But what new tool do you use? That's a very complicated idea.
Well, here, let me just say, it's really what I'm asking is what tool do you most gravitate towards? But you can add the word new if you want. You can
I
add the
mean,
word.
because there are no new tools in some
Yeah,
ways. There never have been new
yeah,
tools. The idea is that to me, I think it's important. I'm not a big fan of irony. I'm not a big fan of sarcasm,
yeah,
even though I use it constantly in my life. And so for me, I guess I'm quite tired of the idea of, well, I would say, not that I'm tired of Duchamp, but the idea of pointing at something and saying, this is art is no longer interesting to me.
yeah,
And so even the idea of parody, I think, has become quite empty because
yeah,
the idea of embodying the thing you're critiquing is sort of,
yeah,
I'm quite interested in directness and
yeah,
simplicity and
yeah,
the idea of a sort of one-to-one kind of math where you might just make a painting about light, and that's okay, and that's
yeah,
enough. That the idea of the thing that is close to you and meaningful to you is enough. So
yeah.
I guess my tool, maybe that would be reducing it to the idea of autobiography
Oh,
and
man.
experience and telling stories that are personally meaningful to you.
No, that is a really great tool. That was so well put. What new toy do you suggest?
New toy. I mean, fun is, I think, so important and very difficult to, the older I get, to give myself this play, the idea of fun,
Yeah.
and not a toy itself, but the idea of doing something because you have an impulse to do it. When you really do find yourself wandering, I often laugh out loud as I'm painting, thinking this is ridiculous, and
Yeah.
it is fun. Because, and that sort of relates to all the stuff I was talking about before. That fun and humor, I'm a big fan of, like, stand up. And I think that it is amazing in that it can hold very complex ideas and allow things to come out that often aren't allowed to come out because we're justifying them. Another thing I tell students sometimes is the painting that needs to be made is the painting that you thought of and immediately were like, that is dumb. Don't make
Yeah.
that. Or
Yeah.
that's embarrassing. That is, and one of the paintings that I had this experience was a painting. I had this idea and I was teaching at Claremont at the time. And I told one of the grad students there, oh, I have this really dumb idea for a painting. I don't think I should make it. And she said, what's the idea? And I said, well, it's a naked woman on the beach with an armada of ships behind her. And she has a gun and the sky. And she was like, that really is a dumb idea for a painting. It sounds like a 12-year-old girl made up that idea. And I said, I know, but I think I'm going to do it. So I went through the whole process of, I got my friend to be the model. I flew to the Northwest. I took photographs. I rented a gun for the photo shoot. So I'm making this painting, which is ridiculous, and it's beautiful, but it's ridiculous. These old fashioned, like, pirate ships in the background. And at one point, the gun, I didn't like it. So I painted the gun out and I was going to paint it back in. So all you saw was her hands holding the gun. And in the end, after I painted the gun out, that was a painting. The painting was the armada of ships, the naked figure, and there was a weapon. There was a holster. She was wearing a holster, but there was no gun. And I couldn't have predicted that it would be such a complex subject. In the end, I just had this impulse, right? You just move toward the impulse and the meaning works itself out, but you have to have the courage to go into territory that is often just plastered with signs that say, do not enter, don't come here, this is cheesy. And I don't mean necessarily like in the way that it's shocking or violent. It's often something that feels like sentimental to me, or something that just puts your hackles up, like people won't like that.
Rebecca, I wanted to bring this up later, but I have to. Milan Kundera, in his book, The Unbearable Likeness of Being, says this about it. This is why I love writing, because the character that I'm writing about can go further than I can. And I'm like, oh, that sounds romantic and poetic. But if I take this ink and put it on a piece of paper and create a character, how can that character go further? And that's what you kind of implied, where you removed the gun from her hands and then the character went further. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm going to use your words from LA Louver. That sounds a little woo woo, but
Yeah.
I know deep down inside what that is. But
Yeah.
how,
It is.
how
Well, and I believe all that woo-woo stuff about
yeah,
painting, that
yeah,
you really have to kind of enter this amoebic space in which, I mean, that's one of the beautiful things about the Doors of Perception and his idea that the brain is a hopper, right? And I think art also just opens the hopper, but you have to get into that space where you're willing to consider anything
yeah,
and put disparate things together, or things that are, you think, should be repellent of each
yeah,
other, to create this kind of there is a bit of that sort of things flowing through you, as
yeah,
opposed to you sort of engineering the work.
Yeah, that's really good. And going back, someone just brought up this, and we know that we're both lovers of music. Walter Pater said, all art aspires to the condition of music. So, like painting, architecture, poetry, all wishes it could be as cool as music. And what do you do with music? You play music. And they
Yeah.
said, yeah, what is the word for art? Artwork. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know. I didn't. Did you ever think of that? Because really, you're
Oh,
saying,
I've said a million times. My husband's a musician. Angus is a musician. My mother was a musician, and I would rather be a musician. I would totally rather. I mean, it's you can dance to it.
yeah.
It's
But I know that, but
joyful.
yeah, I think you're still able to tap into saying I play art because you
Yes
are a
and no. Art.
really,
I don't think art does funny well. I don't think art is good at
yeah,
being funny. I
okay,
don't think it's good at being danceable. I
yeah,
think they have different functions. And
yeah,
it's like I would rather be a person who wanted to be happy than meaningful.
yeah,
I would rather, and I'm not saying music isn't meaningful,
yeah,
but I'm saying like what art does is that it is so I could not pull myself apart from being an artist, and that's just my tough shit, right? Like it you don't choose it. You don't choose your life lessons, because I would choose music. There are so
yeah,
many brilliant things about it, and art is tougher in
yeah,
some ways. It's
yeah,
more difficult, it's more unlikable than music.
yeah. That's really good. Now we got about 4 more minutes. Can you do a couple more, or you got to run?
No, go
Okay,
ahead.
okay. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Dying. That's one of the things I worry about
Yeah,
most. I have a lot of anxiety around death.
yeah. And McLuhan learned from the poet Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. And I mean musicians, artists, painters, architects, poets. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions.
Hmm.
So, Rebecca, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
I don't think we always ignore. I think
Yeah,
culture is sluggishly ambivalent about moving ever,
yeah,
right? We are like water. We like the path of least resistance.
yeah,
And artists are often suggesting we need to change, or we need to endure things that are not necessarily the path of least resistance.
yeah,
So I do think that people resist, but I do think it comes along. It sort of like uh, follows us.
yeah. Do artists have moral obligation?
I mean, the first thing that popped into my head is no. And then I
Yeah,
immediately thought, you can't say that. Because we do live in a different place. I mean, it's the question of like, can we appreciate the art of Picasso knowing what an asshole he was?
yeah,
I mean, maybe this is how I would answer it, which is maybe a cop out, which is yes and no.
yeah,
Both of those things are true at one time. I've explained this weird experience. The first time I came to this idea was through so I'm raised in this very puritanical environment in which nothing was allowed. I found out later in my life that my father, who was the one sort of setting all these rules for us, was breaking some of those rules on his own. And it shattered my worldview of purity and, cleaving to a thing. And So then I responded by becoming like a radical feminist, which has a lot of very big rules too. And at the time, in the particular wave of feminism that I entered in, there was this idea that pornography and was all bad, 100% bad. And then I had an experience of going to a strip club in Portland, Oregon, which has a lot of strip clubs and has a lot of, interestingly, female centric strip clubs. So, anyway, what I had was an experience in which there were like these horrible, gross dudes in the front rubbing their money around who were every bad cliche and abusive, sort of oppressive symbol you could think of. And I had at the same time the experience of having this fantastic time
Yeah.
that was indulgent and permissive and exciting. And as a young feminist, I was like, what is this? What am I experiencing? And what I was experiencing is life, which is two seemingly mutual exclusive things can be true at the same time. It can be oppressive and horrible and something that we need to advocate against. And it can also be forward thinking, liberating, all of those things, which is, the basic experience of life, which
Yeah.
is that it's always been the end of the world. We're
Yeah.
living and we're dying. You can experience joy and pain at the same time, all of those things. So for me, that would be the answer, is that those are both true.
Yeah, it's again embracing contradiction. It,
Yeah,
yeah,
embracing contradiction.
yeah. How has being an artist, one, and being a educator shaped your behavior? Both of them.
Um, Being an artist is, I mentioned earlier that I was on the debate team. The only other thing I thought I might be is a lawyer. And in the end, I chose art because it's the life I want to lead. It actually is how I want to spend my days. So I think I would have been a good lawyer, but I think I would have been a miserable lawyer, because that kind of argumentative and conflict oriented way of living is so counter to what we do as artists, which is more exploratory. There's just like way more dynamics in creation. And so for me, it affects the way I do everything. It affects, I'm constantly stopping the family to look at the spider web and smell that smell. And it pervades all of your life. So that's the way art has changed it. What was the other thing?
How has teaching shaped your behavior?
I retired recently, and it was not it was not my choice. It was conflict oriented. I ended up in a legal situation. Anyway, it was bad. One of my coworkers was basically stalking me. And so I have a very bad taste in my mouth right now about teaching. I don't know. I think people want to say in a kind of Pollyanna way that, like, oh, it's, I learn as much from the students as they learn from me. That it's not true. Of
Yeah.
course, you learn from your students, but it's like parenting in that it is also extremely draining, very difficult work,
Yeah.
and often unrewarded.
Yeah.
Um, and yet you have brilliant students who absolutely change your life in a fundamental way that you couldn't get any other way. So teaching has been profoundly important to me. I think the state of education is abysmal right now. But the act of teaching, I think what I learned about teaching is I don't think I came to teaching at the right period of history, because I mean, again, it's hard to separate from the systems that you're in. And the state of higher education right now is that students pay a fee and hope they're going to get a degree in return, as opposed to paying for the opportunity to learn what you have to offer them. And so I think that education in that way, in a kind of mentorship mode, is more where I sit and where most artists sit, because when you try and push something as abstract and ethereal as art education through a system as rigid and broken as the current state of Western education, like, how are you going to quantify? Figure drawing would be a very basic place to start. Like, the system is going to want you to have a rubric that can predict in a regular way what will get an A and what will get an F. And that just doesn't exist in the art world, because some student is going to come along and they're going to miss most of the classes. And then they're going to be really intense when they get there. And they might give you one genius drawing and a bunch of garbage. And they might be brilliant, right? And so we're left. This is a funny way to explain it. I was in a conversation when I was a student. I was the student at UCLA, and I was talking to Charlie Ray, and we were talking about this huge painting, and he really loved it. It was the painting that Wolfgang Tillmans hated, and Charlie Ray really liked it. And we spent way too much time talking about it. And he's very animated. And at the end of the conversation, he was trying to find the words. And he said, it just needs to implode. It needs a level of implosion. And I knew exactly what he was saying after this, which is so abstract. How could you ever write that into a syllabus? How could you ever explain what he was trying to say? And yet we were like this, like, I totally got it, what he was, and it was exactly what I needed to hear to solve this painting, to resolve the painting in some way. And that kind of education, I mean, it's why I would still and have always had the dream of a new kind of Bauhaus. And one of the things I think that artists crave and need as part of the conversation now, artists feel like they have to go to an urban center to get access to the shows, the collectors, the privileges, all the stuff, but they yearn for isolation and for nature and the earth and experientially based things. And I feel like it would be wonderful if there were a new powerhouse art school model that was built in a rural location that could address these contemporary issues of the disappearing of rural space and the kind of unlivability of urban space now. So I'm very interested in arts education, but I don't know how you get it done in the current configuration. Last kind of rant is that the other problem, because partially of the kind of academy and this top heavy, everybody doing post studio practice, we are churning out thousands and thousands of MFAs that have no job to go to, that are sort of getting these degrees and want to use them as currency, as opposed to looking at the degree, I mean, as just looking at the place of education as a place to study and a place to acquire skills and information. And it would be nice if there were another model that could return us. And again, not to go backward, because we can't go back to Black Mountain, we can't go back to Bauhaus, but maybe that can propel us forward past this sort of constipated state of art education, so we can go more quickly. Artists are very efficient. We don't need fucking rubrics. We need to go. We got to go. We got things to do. And the state of education is slowing us down.
Yeah. I love that you use the word rant, because I asked this great Joyce student, I don't know what I think until she goes, rant on it for 30 minutes. And I goes, that's beautiful. You get it out of your system. But what you said was amazing. Again, you have to have ESP. Because I was just about to say Black Mountain, because I was fortunate last week. I was asked to guest lecture at Mountain School of the Arts. I don't know if you know about it, but it's like a Black Mountain in LA
Oh,
for
really?
like 20 years. I'll hook you up because they should have you.
Oh,
And
please do.
they don't pay you, and the students don't pay. It's 50,
Wow.
it's 15 students from around the world for 2 weeks in LA. And it was
Huh.
amazing to sit there with these 14 people. And I just did this kind of thing. I did round robin with my questions, and
Yeah,
it was amazing. And uh,
it
and I
sounds
was going to say,
beautiful.
it feels like Black Mountain, especially like, what do you mean you don't pay? No. And I mean, I wasn't asking to be paid. The students don't pay,
Yeah.
and you fill out an application, and it's like 3 paragraphs. They don't even do a live interview with you. They get 400 from
Wow.
around the world. So anyways, I'll turn you on to it. You probably
Yeah.
know Piero Golia. He's
Mm.
run it for anyways, but they've had all major artists work, be a guest lecturer, go to their studio or whatever.
It sounds awesome. And
Yeah,
I think that yeah, I think we all kind of know that that adjustments need to be made.
yeah.
Something's amiss.
Yeah, yeah. And Rebecca, I so appreciate your time today because it's so enlightening. And I hope we can plan a part two, maybe 3, 4, 5 months down the line, because
Sure.
I got barely into a quarter of the questions. And it's like, I
Well,
love it.
hopefully that's a good thing.
I love it because I've found now in 40 years of interviewing over 1,000, that if I just sort of chill out and don't try to shove the 90 minute the all the questions into 90 minutes,
Right.
it's amazing because the tangents we went on were so more important in the
Yeah.
long run. And I just want to end with this. They asked, with you saying, your favorite form of information is talking, conversation, and and it's with other people. And Wilhelm Reich said, what's the best thing for a human being? He says, another human being. And
Yeah.
then Groucho Marx was asked at the end of his life, what gives you the most optimism? And he said, other people.
Mm.
So it's sure been fun spending this time with another person, especially because it was you, Rebecca. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was really a nice interview. I really appreciated your questions. And yeah, let's do it again.
Let's do it again, and definitely hook me up with your son because I'm ready and willing.
Oh, I will. And I'll send you the name of that. I can't remember, but I'll send you the book I'm talking about.
Very cool. Thank you so much. Even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button now, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
week.